She hadn't trusted a man's word in 3 years. Not since the last one stood in her doorway with his hat in his hands and told her everything was going to be fine, 2 days before the fever took him anyway. So when the giant showed up at her fence line in the middle of a dust storm, bleeding from somewhere she couldn't see, and said those 2 words, "Trust me," her first instinct wasn't hope. It was fury. Because trust isn't a thing you ask for, it's a thing you earn. And out here, on the high desert flats where the wind strips paint off barn wood and the Apache don't come to visit unless something's already wrong, out here, a stranger's promise is just noise dressed up in good grammar. But he wasn't asking her to believe in him. He was asking her to believe in something she'd stopped believing in entirely. And that, more than anything he said or did or bled on her property, is what left her speechless. This is the story of what happened next. Narrated by Emmett Brace, former Army surveyor, now keeping land records for the Territorial Office of Yavapai County, Arizona. A man who counts steps obsessively and writes down distances in the margins of everything, including this account. The storm came in from the northwest the way they always do out here, not with any particular warning, just a slow yellowing of the sky that a man with experience reads as get inside, and a man without it reads as interesting weather. I was neither man that afternoon. I was standing on the ridge above the Haverson property with my transit and my field notebook, trying to get an accurate survey reading on the eastern boundary line before the light failed. And I had my back to that yellowing sky because the eastern line was where the dispute was, and the dispute was what I was being paid to resolve. The Haverson widow, Marta Haverson, née Ruiz, who had taken her late husband's name, but not, from everything I'd observed, his tendency toward cheerfulness, had filed a complaint with the Territorial Office claiming her neighbor to the north, a cattle operation run by a man named Creed Dunmore, had moved her fence line 90 feet east over the course of the previous 2 summers. 90 feet, that's a lot of ground to steal quietly. My job was to determine if the original survey markers still existed, compare them to current fence placement, and file a report. It was the sort of work that sounds simple until you're doing it, standing in the high desert in August with your boots turning the color of the earth around you, sweating through a shirt that cost more than it should have, and counting your steps between stakes with the obsessive precision that my commanding officer back in the war had called a gift and my wife had called a disease. She wasn't wrong. I count everything. Steps, fence posts, days since something bad happened. I count the words in documents I'm asked to sign before I sign them. I count the number of times a man blinks when he's telling me something he wants me to believe. I've gotten very good at knowing when the count is off. The count that afternoon was definitely off. I'd found the first original survey stake, a piece of iron pipe, half buried, stamped with the territorial marker I recognized from the records, at exactly the location the original 1871 survey said it should be. The new fence ran 92 feet to the east of it. Not 90. 92. Dunmore hadn't just stolen her land. He'd stolen slightly more than he probably meant to, which suggested either greed outrunning precision or someone who couldn't read a measurement correctly. I was writing this down in the margin of my field notebook, 92 FT, not 90, check original plat, when the wind changed. It didn't gust, it shifted. There's a difference that anyone who's spent time in the desert understands in their bones before they understand it in their head. A gust is temporary pressure. A shift is the atmosphere rearranging itself, committing to something. I turned around. The sky was the color of old copper, and it was moving toward me like a living thing. I made it to the Haverson homestead in what I later calculated to be 11 minutes. I counted my steps the whole way. Couldn't help it, old habit. And the math worked out to roughly 11 minutes at the pace I was keeping, which was somewhere between a fast walk and a man who didn't want to admit he was frightened running flat out across broken ground. The homestead was modest by any standard except the standard of what it took to build something out here at all, which made it extraordinary by that measure. A main house of adobe and timber, single-story, with a covered porch that faced south toward the flats. A barn that had been recently resited on the windward face. I noticed the new planking, lighter colored than the rest. A root cellar with a wooden door set flush against a small rise. A well with a hand pump. Fencing that up close showed the work of someone who understood tension and did it properly. The widow was already on the porch when I came around the corner of the barn, and she had a shotgun. She wasn't pointing it at me. She was holding it across her body in the way that means I know how this works and I'm deciding, barrel angled slightly down, both hands on it, eyes on the storm coming in behind me. She was a compact woman, maybe 35, dark-haired, with the kind of face that had probably been described as handsome rather than pretty by people who meant it as a compliment, and were mostly right. Her work clothes were practical and worn, and told you everything about her days without her having to say a word about them. She looked at me for exactly the amount of time it takes to decide a man isn't an immediate threat, then looked back at the storm. "Root cellar," she said. "I need to get my equipment." "Your equipment," she said, with a tone that communicated clearly that my equipment could manage on its own, "will still be equipment after the storm. Go." I went. She followed me, still holding the shotgun, and pulled the cellar door open with one hand in a motion that said she'd done this 10,000 times, which she probably had. We were 3 steps down when the wind hit the house. A dust storm in the high desert isn't what people who haven't experienced one imagine. They think of a wall of dust like a curtain. What it actually is, what this one was, is a full sensory replacement. The sound first, a roar that starts low and builds to something that stops resembling wind and starts resembling a geological event. Then the pressure, you feel it in your sinuses, in your ears, in the back of your throat. Then the darkness, which comes fast and absolute and makes noon feel like the bottom of a well. Inside the root cellar, with the heavy wooden door latched above us, it was just sound. The roar of it came through the earth, muffled but constant, and the lantern Marta Haverson lit with the practiced ease of someone who kept her supplies exactly where she expected them cast a circle of orange light that made the space feel smaller than it was. It wasn't a large space, maybe 8 feet by 10, shelves along 2 walls stocked with the careful order of a woman who thought about what she might need and then made sure she had it. Dried goods in labeled tins, water in sealed clay jars. A blanket on a shelf folded tight, a small medical kit, the kind you recognize from Army field use. I was writing in my notebook. I can't help it. The counting settles me, and in the absence of distance I count words when she spoke. "You found the stakes." It wasn't a question. "Yes, ma'am." "How far?" 92 feet. She absorbed that the way a person absorbs information they already suspected but needed confirmed. Her jaw shifted slightly. Her hands, resting on her knees now, the shotgun leaned against the shelf beside her, were absolutely still. "He'll contest it," she said. "Probably." "He has a lawyer in Prescott, man named Aldridge. You'll know him when you meet him, because he asks you how you are at the start of every conversation and doesn't listen to the answer." "I've met that lawyer in 20 different suits," I said. Something almost moved at the corner of her mouth, not quite a smile, the memory of one. We sat in the silence under the roar for a while. I wrote down measurements I already had because my hands needed something to do. She sat with the particular stillness of a woman who had learned to inhabit waiting. Then from above us, above the root cellar door, above the sound of the storm, there was a knock. Not a knock, a hit, something solid striking the door from outside with force. Marta Haverson had the shotgun up before I'd fully registered the sound. She looked at me, I looked at the door. The hit came again, 3 times deliberate, spaced. Not random debris, a pattern. "That's a person," I said. "I know what that is," she said. She didn't move toward the door. Neither did I. We stayed in the orange circle of the lantern and listened to whoever was on the other side of that door, in the middle of a dust storm that was trying to unmake the landscape, knock a 3rd time. "Apache?" I asked. "Apache wouldn't knock," she said. She was right. I'd spent enough time in the territory to know she was right. She moved toward the door. I said, "Mrs. Haverson." "I heard you, Mr. Brace," she said without turning around. "Write it down in your notebook. Woman opens door in storm, see what you get." She lifted the latch. The door came up and the storm came in, not in full. The cellar stairwell created a pocket of relative shelter, but enough to fill the space with a fine sifting of red dust and the full sound of it, which was enormous. Above us, framed by the doorway and the dark copper sky and the horizontal movement of the world, was the largest man I'd ever seen. He was Caucasian, though darkened by sun to something close to the earth around him. 6.5 feet at the minimum, broad-shouldered in a way that seemed structural rather than muscular, like the frame of him was simply built to different specifications than other men. He wore a canvas duster that the wind was trying to tear off him, a battered hat he was holding to his head with one hand, and an expression that I can only describe as apologetic, which seemed an unusual expression for a man his size to be wearing in the middle of a natural disaster. His other hand was pressed against his left side. Blood, black in the orange light, was seeping between his fingers. He was looking at Marta Haverson with the focus of a man who has chosen a specific destination and arrived at it after considerable difficulty, and does not intend to fall down quite yet. "Trust me," he said. His voice was low, carrying even over the storm the kind of voice that a large chest produces without effort. He stopped, seemed to reconsider what he needed. "I need you to trust me. I know what that sounds like. I know you don't know me, but there are people following me and I didn't lead them here and I need." He stopped again, his hand pressed harder against his side. "I need to not fall down on your property if I can help it," he said, "because then you'd have to move me and I suspect I'm heavy." Marta Haverson looked at him for exactly 4 seconds. I counted. "Get in," she said. His name was Caleb Morrow. He told us this the way he told us everything, economically, without decoration. In the intervals between focusing on the pain, he was clearly managing by some internal method he didn't explain. He sat on the floor of the root cellar because the floor was the only thing that could accommodate him, his back against the shelving, and he answered questions in the order they were asked with a seriousness that suggested he understood his position clearly. Marta Haverson's hands were already in the medical kit. "The wound," she said. He lifted the duster. The shirt beneath was soaked through on the left side. He'd been shot, I could see that much, but the angle was strange, more of a graze along the ribs than a direct penetration. "Entry and exit?" she asked. "Graze, rib 5 or 6, cracked maybe, not broken through." "You know your anatomy." "Learned it the hard way," he said. She cut his shirt away from the wound without asking permission and without ceremony, and cleaned it with the same efficiency she'd shown opening the cellar door. He made no sound while she worked. The effort of not making sound was visible on his face, a tightening around the eyes, a slight flaring of his nostrils, but he held it. "Who shot you?" I asked. "Men working for a man named Dunmore," he said. I stopped writing. Marta Haverson's hands stilled for just a moment, then continued. "Creed Dunmore," she said, not a question. "You know him?" "I know of him," she said. "He's been stealing my land for 2 years." Caleb Morrow looked at her. Something passed across his face that was more complicated than pain. "Ma'am," he said, "I think he's doing more than that." The storm roared above us. The lantern swayed on its hook. "Tell me," she said, and kept working on his wound, and he told us. What Caleb Morrow told us, in the intervals between pain and the sound of the storm and Marta Haverson's careful work with bandaging, was this. He'd come to the territory 6 weeks prior, not as a drifter but with a specific purpose. He had worked as a range detective, the kind that cattle associations hired to track rustlers and land fraud, and he'd been retained, though he wouldn't say by whom, to investigate a pattern of homestead consolidation in Yavapai County. Small holdings, widow farms, old Army claims, uncontested parcels being acquired by a series of land companies that, when you looked at them carefully enough, all shared the same attorney in Prescott. Aldridge, I thought, I didn't say it yet. The method was consistent. Fence lines moved, water rights contested on technical grounds, tax filings adjusted in ways that were difficult to challenge without legal expertise the homesteaders didn't have. When those methods failed, other methods were applied. Pressure, harassment, occasionally violence of the kind that couldn't be easily proven. Caleb had been tracking the pattern for 3 weeks, moving through the county on a route he hadn't shared with anyone, gathering documentation. 2 days ago he'd found something. He was careful about what he said here, and I noticed Marta noticing his carefulness, that he hadn't expected to find. Something that went beyond land fraud. He'd been followed since yesterday morning. He'd spent a night in the open, moving west, trying to reach a telegraph station. The shot had caught him at dawn, from distance, from a man positioned on the ridge above the main road. He'd chosen the Haverson property specifically, not randomly. Why? Marta asked. She was tying off the bandage now, her movements precise. He looked at her steadily. Because your husband was a decent man, he said, and I knew his name from the records. And the records showed someone trying to erase the fact that he'd ever been here. The silence that followed that sentence was different from the silences before it. Marta Haverson sat back on her heels. Her hands rested on her thighs. She was looking at Caleb Morrow with an expression I didn't have a name for, not grief, exactly, not anger, but something that lived in the same general territory as both, and was refusing to be either. His name is in the records, she said quietly. It will stay in the records. Yes, ma'am, Caleb said. That's what I intend to make sure of. Outside, the storm continued. Inside the root cellar, in the orange light of the swaying lantern, the three of us sat with the weight of what had just been said, and I wrote down nothing, because some things don't need to be counted. They just need to be witnessed. I should say something about what I noticed in those first hours, because it matters to what came later, and because the things you notice first are often the truest things. Caleb Morrow was in considerable pain and trying not to show it, which told me something about his relationship to vulnerability. He wasn't stoic in the way of men who think pain is weakness. It was more that he seemed to genuinely believe that other people's comfort mattered more than his own discomfort, and displaying pain would have required those around him to respond to it, which would have cost them something he didn't want to cost them. Marta Haverson was not trusting him. I want to be precise about this. She had let him in and treated his wound and was listening to him, but her trust, whatever that word meant to her after 3 years of managing this land alone, was not on the table. She was extending a kind of provisional hospitality, the kind that a person who has survived alone extends when the math of the situation demands it. The math was, man bleeding on your doorstep in a storm, follow-on threat potentially incoming. He has information you need, you have shelter he needs. That's the math. It doesn't require trust, it requires calculation. What I noticed, and this is the thing I keep coming back to, the thing I wrote in the margin of my field notebook that night, while the storm died down outside and Caleb Morrow slept in the corner with his breathing shallow and careful, was that he seemed to understand this about her. He wasn't asking her to trust him in the way that men usually ask women things. He wasn't pressing or persuading or turning on whatever warmth he might have had available to him in better circumstances. He'd said the words and he'd let them sit, and he'd accepted what she gave him, shelter, medical attention, provisional hearing, without asking for more. Which was, I realized, writing it down in my margins by lantern light, with the sound of the last of the storm sighing itself out over the desert, the most effective possible approach. And whether it was calculated or genuine, I genuinely could not tell. That uncertainty was the thing I took to sleep with me, wrapped in the blanket Marta handed me without comment, on the root cellar floor with a man I'd known for 4 hours and a woman I'd known for 4 days, while somewhere out in the settling dust, men with guns were looking for us. Narrated by Emmett Brace, continuing, written the following morning, amended later in pencil where memory and record disagreed. The storm was gone by the time I woke, and the morning that replaced it was the kind that only comes after violence of weather, scoured and still and achingly clear. The sky a blue so deep it looked like something you could fall into. The desert floor resettled into new shapes that were the same as the old shapes and somehow different. I'd slept 3 hours, maybe 4. The root cellar still smelled of dust and lamp oil and the iron-copper edge of Caleb Morrow's blood. He was awake when I opened my eyes, sitting with his back against the shelving and his eyes on the ceiling, which told me he'd either never fully slept or had woken long before me and been sitting with his thoughts in the dark. Marta Haverson was not in the cellar. She went up an hour ago, Caleb said, answering my unasked question. His voice was rougher in the morning, the full bass of it sandpapered down. Said she had animals to check. Her animals, I said. Yes. How's the rib? He considered the question with the seriousness he gave everything. Workable, he said. The bandage held, she knows what she's doing. She's been out here alone for 3 years, I said. I know. I reached for my notebook, old habit, something to hold. What was it? I said. What did you find that you were careful about saying? He looked at me for a long moment, evaluating. I let him evaluate. I'm good at being evaluated. Years of army surveying trains you to hold still and let the territory look at you before you start trying to read it. How well do you know the land records? He asked. Well enough, it's my job. Going back 15 years. I have access to everything filed since territorial organization. Before that is more complicated, depends on what was preserved. There's a grant, he said. A Spanish land grant from before American acquisition, 2,000 acres in the northern section of this county. The original grantee's family line ended, or appeared to end, in 1864. The land was absorbed into the territorial system as unclaimed. Then it was parceled and assigned. Then those parcels were bought up, quietly over 10 years, through 3 different holding companies, by the same interest. Dunmore. Not exactly Dunmore, above Dunmore. He shifted slightly, and the effort of it cost him something. I saw it in the way his jaw set. Dunmore is a method. The interest behind him is larger. I found the original grant documentation at a mission archived 2 counties west. The family line didn't end. There are descendants. Living descendants who were never notified, never compensated, never given the opportunity to contest. I had stopped writing, not because I'd run out of words, because the weight of what he was describing had a gravity that made my hand feel insufficient. You're talking about theft on a scale? Yes, he said simply. I'm talking about theft on a scale that required a lot of people to look in specific directions at specific times. And Mrs. Haverson's property is inside the original grant boundary, he said. Her late husband's claim wasn't filed under the grant. He didn't know about the grant. But whoever moved her fence line 2 feet at a time over 2 years knows exactly where the lines are. They're erasing the markers before anyone can trace the original survey, before people like you can look at the record and see what's missing. I thought about the survey stake I'd found yesterday. The iron pipe with the territorial marker 92 feet inside the new fence line. I thought about what it meant that I'd found it. The original survey stakes, I said slowly. If they still exist, they can be cross-referenced against the original grant maps. And the grant maps, he stopped. You have them, I said. Some of them. He reached into the inside of his duster, moving carefully around the bandaged rib, and produced a folded, oilskin-wrapped packet. He held it but didn't hand it to me. This is what they followed me for. Marta Haverson came back down the cellar stairs 20 minutes later with a tin pot of coffee and the news that 2 horses were tied to her north fence line. Not her horses. She delivered this information with a flatness that I was beginning to understand was not indifference, but its opposite. The way a person who feels things very strongly learns to report them without flinching. Tied, not hitched, she said, like they came in quiet and didn't expect to need to leave fast. Caleb was already on his feet. How many horses, he said, is how many men? 2 horses. Doesn't mean 2 men. No, she agreed. We stood in the small space of the root cellar and thought about what 2 horses on the north fence line meant. I could feel the count in my head starting, distance, angles, approach routes, the surveyor's instinct reducing everything to geometry. The barn, I said. If they're coming in quiet from the north, they'll want to check the outbuildings before they approach the house. Which means the barn first, Marta said. Or simultaneously, Caleb said. 1 to the barn, 1 to the house. Can you shoot? Marta asked Caleb. Yes. Are you going to fall down while you're doing it? A beat, probably not. That's honest, she said, and handed him a rifle from the rack I hadn't noticed on the back wall of the cellar. A root cellar, I was realizing, that had been organized not just for drought and storm, but for this kind of morning. She had thought about this. Maybe not these specific men, these specific horses, but this kind of situation, this kind of decision. She handed me a pistol without a word. Mrs. Haverson, I said. You can write this down later, she said. Emmett. First name, I hadn't given her permission to use it, but out here, in this moment, permission was a concept from another kind of life. Yes, ma'am, I said. Here is what I wrote down later, reconstructed from notes I made as soon as my hands stopped shaking, which was approximately 40 minutes after it ended. The 2 men were professionals in the way that hired men are professional, methodical, unhurried, competent in the basic mechanics. They came to the barn first, as I'd predicted, which I take no satisfaction in having predicted. One went in through the main door, one came around to the rear. Caleb Morrow was in the barn. I want to be precise about how he managed this because what he did wasn't what I expected. I expected the gun in his hand, the size of him, the injury notwithstanding. I expected something confrontational. I expected the meeting of forces that his physical presence seemed designed for. What happened was that he talked to the first man. He was in the hayloft. He'd gone up despite the rib. And later I asked him about this, and he said high ground the way a man says something so obvious he's slightly embarrassed to have to explain it. And when the first man came through the barn door and stood letting his eyes adjust, Caleb said from above him, quietly and without aggression, "I know who sent you." The man went very still. "I know his name and I know what he's after, and I have the documentation that makes the whole enterprise collapse," Caleb continued, in that low voice that carried without effort. "You've been hired to recover property and remove a problem. I'd like to suggest that the property isn't worth what you've been promised, and the problem is now much larger than you were told." I was at the barn door, back against the exterior wall, listening. My heart was doing something complex and unpleasant. "That documentation," Caleb said, "is not on my person. It's in the hands of a territorial surveyor who has already seen enough to file a report with the territorial office. Which means killing me accomplishes nothing for the man who hired you, and killing a federal contractor adds a dimension to this situation that I suspect neither you nor your employer anticipated." A long pause, dust in the morning light, the sound of horses somewhere. "I'm not interested in you," Caleb said. "I'm not going to pursue you or report you. You're a working man doing a working man's job, and you didn't sign up for a federal case. But I need you to leave this property and take your partner with you, and I need you to tell the man who hired you that the documentation is already moving toward Prescott." Another pause. The man in the barn had not moved. "Is that a fair offer?" Caleb asked. I heard the man let out a long breath, the kind of breath a person releases when they've been holding it since before they arrived. "The documents," the man said, "they're really already gone." "What I've told you is accurate," Caleb said, which was not quite the same thing as yes, I noticed. "Hell," the man said, and then louder, calling toward the back of the barn, "Gus, we're done." They rode out the way they'd come in, north. I watched them go from the barn door, counting the seconds between when they turned from the fence line and when they disappeared into the scrubland, roughly 4 minutes, which told me approximately how fast they were moving, which told me approximately how seriously they'd taken the conversation. Fast enough, seriously enough. Caleb came down from the hayloft in a way that clearly cost him and didn't acknowledge that it had cost him. He stood in the barn with his rifle held loose at his side and watched the direction the men had gone. Marta Haverson came around from the side of the house. She'd been covering the approach from the south, a position I hadn't assigned her because I hadn't known she'd taken it, and crossed the yard and came into the barn and looked at Caleb Morrow for a long time. "You could have shot them," she said. "Yes," he said. "Why didn't you?" He considered the question the way he considered most questions, with genuine attention, like the answer mattered more than the time it took to find it. "Because they're not the problem," he said, "and because shooting people tends to make the problem louder, and because—" He stopped, looked at the bandaging visible at his side through the torn shirt. "Because I'm not sure I could have hit them from up there with this rib without embarrassing myself." That last thing he said, the admission of limitation, offered with such complete lack of drama, cracked something open in the silence. Marta Haverson made a sound that was almost a laugh. Not quite. Something adjacent to it, surprised out of her, like it had been waiting somewhere she'd forgotten and the key had turned without warning. It lasted maybe 2 seconds. Then she pressed her lips together and looked out the barn door at the empty scrubland and the blue morning sky. "Come inside," she said. "I'll make food." We ate at her kitchen table, salt pork and cornbread and coffee so strong it reorganized my thoughts, and Caleb Morrow laid out the oilskin packet on the table and showed us the documents. "I am a surveyor. I know what I'm looking at when I look at land records. What he had was extraordinary. The original Spanish land grant, copied in a priest's hand in 1798 from an older document, describing 2,014 acres of high desert in what was now northern Yavapai County. A series of subsequent records, land transfers, family registrations, the paper trail of a family called Bautista over 60 years. Then in 1864, a gap. Records of forced removal recorded obliquely in mission documents as resettlement. Then silence. Then from Caleb's own investigation, the reconstruction of what came after. Property absorbed as abandoned. Parcel numbers reassigned. Companies formed, dissolved, reformed with different names and the same directors. A map of land acquisition that, when you laid it over the original grant boundary, matched it almost perfectly. The Haverson homestead was on the eastern edge. I looked at the map for a long time. I measured distances in my head, the habit, always the habit, and then I looked at Marta. "Your husband filed his claim in good faith," I said. "There was nothing to indicate the prior grant. The territorial records showed the land as available." "I know that," she said. "The original grantee's descendants." "Are they traceable?" Caleb asked me. "With the mission records and what you have here?" I thought about it carefully because this was the kind of question that deserved careful thought. "Possibly, probably, it would take time." "Time is something we might not have a lot of," Marta said. She was looking at the map. Her finger traced the eastern boundary, the line near her fence, the line someone had been trying to erase. "If Dunmore knows you have these documents." "He knows I had them," Caleb said. "He doesn't know what I did with them." "What did you do with them?" I asked. "I told those men they were already on their way to Prescott." He paused. "They're not yet. But they need to be." He looked at me with the directness that I'd noticed was his default mode. Not aggressive, just the directness of a man who'd learned that the oblique approach cost time he didn't always have. "You're going to Prescott," he said. "You have to file your survey report. If you take these documents with your report to the territorial office and not to any private attorney, and you file them as evidence in an ongoing land fraud investigation." "I'm a surveyor," I said, "not a lawman." "The territorial office has authority to refer matters to the U.S. Marshal," Caleb said. "Your report, combined with this documentation, gives them grounds to do exactly that." "And if Dunmore has people watching the road to Prescott?" "He does," Caleb said, with the equanimity of a man who has already accounted for this. "Which is why you won't take the main road." I thought about that. I thought about the routes I knew from my survey work, the creek beds, the old mission trails, the paths that weren't on any current map, but that a man who spent his days measuring distance had traced in his head from a dozen different surveys. "How long?" Marta asked. She was looking at me. 2 days, I said. "Maybe less if the ground dried fast after the storm." She nodded, turned to Caleb. "You're not riding anywhere for at least a week," she said. "That rib will tear open again." "Ma'am, that isn't a suggestion," she said. "That's the medical opinion of someone who's sewn up 3 men after range accidents and watched one of them die because he didn't rest when he was told to. So you'll stay." The word "stay" sat in the kitchen air with a weight that seemed to surprise her as much as him. She didn't take it back. She picked up her coffee cup instead and looked out the kitchen window at the morning light on the desert. Caleb Morrow looked at her profile for a moment. Just a moment, brief enough that I might have missed it if I hadn't been counting things by instinct. And then he looked at the documents on the table. "All right," he said quietly. Not "yes, ma'am," not "thank you." Just "all right," in a tone that meant something I didn't think he was going to explain to either of us. I packed my saddlebags that afternoon with the careful deliberation of a man who knows he might not get to pack again for a while. My survey equipment, my notebooks, the documentation Caleb had given me wrapped in the oilskin inside the innermost pocket of my coat. I noted the weight distribution. I counted the items. Before I left, I stopped at the kitchen doorway. Marta Haverson was at the table. She'd laid out her husband's land claim documents, the originals, from the tin box where she clearly kept things that mattered, and was reading through them with a steadiness that told me she'd read them before and wasn't surprised by anything she was finding and was doing it anyway. Because sometimes you read things again not to learn from them, but to remind yourself what you're fighting for. Caleb was in the chair across from her, the chair that faced the door. I noticed he'd chosen that chair specifically, and he was doing nothing. Just sitting with his hands rested on the table and his eyes forward and the careful, shallow breathing of a man managing pain without wanting to. He wasn't reading. He wasn't talking. He was just present in the room with her, while she did what she needed to do. I don't know why that particular image stayed with me. A large man in a small chair, breathing carefully, being present without requiring anything in return. Maybe because it was the quietest act of respect I'd seen in a long time. I said goodbye. Marta told me to come back, which I understood to mean that she expected I would, which I understood to mean she was trusting the math again, and the math said I would. I rode out into the afternoon, on a route I'd already mapped in my head, carrying documentation that could shift the history of a county. I counted my horse's steps for a while, then I stopped. Some things you don't need to measure. You just need to carry them to where they need to go. End of Part 2. Distance from Haverson Homestead to the Mission Trail Junction, approximately 6,000 steps. I counted the first 1,000 and stopped. I made Prescott in a day and a half. The route I'd chosen, cross-country to the old Mission Trail, then northeast along the creek beds that drained into the Agua Fria watershed, was longer in distance and shorter in everything that mattered. I didn't see another rider until I was within 8 miles of town. I kept my hand near the inside pocket of my coat for most of that ride and counted things when the quiet got too loud, which out in the high desert it sometimes does. I filed the survey report at the territorial office on the morning of my second day. The Surveyor General, a man named Horace Fleet, methodical, perpetually ink-stained, the kind of bureaucrat who is boring in most circumstances and invaluable in a few, read my report with the attention it deserved, and then he read the documentation from the oilskin packet, and his face did something I hadn't seen it do in 4 years of working under him. It went still. Not blank, still. The difference is that blankness is the absence of expression and stillness is the presence of an expression that is being controlled. "Where did you obtain this?" he said. "From a range detective working under private retention," I said. "His name is Caleb Morrow. He's recovering from a gunshot wound at the Haverson Homestead in northern Yavapai. He's the primary witness to the chain of custody of this documentation." "Shot by whom?" "Men working for Creed Dunmore." Horace Fleet looked at me over his reading glasses with the expression he reserved for people who brought him complications. "Emmett," he said, "how long have you been working for me?" "4 years, sir." "And in 4 years you have brought me?" He thought about it. One potential complication, which was the Whitmore grazing dispute, and that resolved itself when Whitmore died. "Yes, sir." "This is not that," he said. "No, sir," I agreed. He was quiet for a moment, looking at the documents. "I'm going to need to contact the marshal's office," he said. "That was the intention, sir." "And the attorney of record for the consolidating interests." "Aldridge in Prescott," I said. Another stillness. "Then how do you know about Aldridge?" "Mrs. Haverson mentioned him." Horace Fleet took his glasses off and cleaned them with his handkerchief, which was a thing he did when he needed a moment that didn't require him to look at anything in particular. "Go get some sleep," he said. "Come back this afternoon. This is going to take some time to do correctly, and doing it correctly is the only way it gets done at all." "Yes, sir." "And Emmett," he was putting his glasses back on, already reaching for the documentation again. "You said the detective is at the Haverson Homestead. Is the homestead secure?" I thought about a woman who kept a rifle in her root cellar and organized her root cellar for exactly this kind of emergency, and had taken the southern position without being asked, and had, in the middle of the worst night in recent memory, handed out medical care and shotguns with equal efficiency. "Yes, sir," I said. "I believe it is." The marshal's office moved faster than I expected, which either meant the documentation was as significant as Caleb had believed, or the marshal had already been watching Dunmore for reasons of his own. Both, I later learned. It's usually both. 2 deputy marshals rode out to the northern county within 3 days. Dunmore's operation was placed under formal investigation. Aldridge, the attorney in Prescott, was found to have filed documents with the territorial office that were, in the polite language of the legal summons, inconsistent with the factual record, which was the formal way of saying he'd helped falsify land records for 10 years, and was now going to spend a considerable amount of time explaining that. The investigation of the Spanish land grant and the Bautista family's descendants was a slower and more complicated matter. I won't pretend otherwise. The law moves at its own pace, and the pace of justice on questions of historical dispossession is particularly slow, weighted as it is with generations of decisions that people in comfortable offices preferred not to reconsider. There were descendants. The mission records and Caleb's documentation confirmed this, and a territorial investigator eventually located 2 surviving family members in Sonora. What happened after that is a longer story than this account can hold, and some of it is still unresolved. But the record was corrected. The original grant was acknowledged. The chain of fraud was documented. That at least happened. I know because I helped it happen, and I have the survey notes and the filed reports and the margins of my field notebook to prove it. 412 steps from the territorial office door to the telegraph office. I know because I counted. I went back to the Haverson homestead 12 days after I'd left. The official reason was that I needed Marta Haverson's signature on amended survey documents that recognized the original boundary stakes and superseded the fraudulent fence placement. The real reason, and I note this here because I've committed to an accurate account, was that I wanted to see how things stood. The ride in from the south was familiar now. The scrubland, the ridge where I'd been working when the storm came. The fence line where the stakes had told their quiet story of theft. The homestead itself, looking different in the particular way that places look different when you've been through something in them and then come back. 2 horses in the yard that I didn't recognize. I rode in cautiously and then recognized one of them, a large, dark bay, 17 hands at least, with a blaze on his nose that I remembered seeing in Marta's barn. Caleb's horse, presumably, still here. Which meant Caleb was still here. 12 days, the rib would be mending. He could ride, probably. He hadn't ridden. The decision to note what I noticed and not assign meaning to it, that, I think, was the right call. Some things announce themselves without needing an interpreter. Marta came out of the house when she heard my horse. She was wearing the same practical work clothes, but something in her bearing was slightly different. Not looser, exactly, but less braced. Like a person who has been holding against expected impact and has started cautiously to let their weight shift. "The documents are filed?" she asked. "Filed and accepted. The amended survey supersedes the Dunmore fence placement. The boundary reverts to the original stakes." She absorbed this, and the investigation. "Moving, I can't tell you how fast or to what end, but it's moving." She nodded once, then, "Come in." Caleb was in the kitchen. He was at the table, the same chair as before, the one facing the door, and he had a knife and a piece of leather in his hands, and he was working on something with the careful attention of a man who has been given time and doesn't know quite what to do with it, and so fills it with small, purposeful tasks. He looked up when I came in, and something in his face shifted in the way I'd noticed his face shift when things went in a direction he could accept. "Brace," he said. "Morrow. How's Prescott?" "Ink-stained and alarmed," I said, "the way it should be." He almost smiled. It was a close thing. I sat down at the table, and Marta poured coffee without asking, which told me something about how I'd been incorporated into whatever this household had become. And then we talked through the details of the filing and the investigation and what it meant and what it didn't yet mean. After a while, the practical conversation ran out, the way practical conversation does when what's underneath it is more interesting. "You're still here," I said to Caleb, not accusingly, just observationally. "The rib," he said. 12 days. Ribs take time." "They do," I agreed. He looked at me with the equanimity of a man who has made a decision and is comfortable with it, and is also aware that the decision is visible and is not especially bothered by that. Marta at the counter said nothing, but the set of her shoulders said something in the language of posture that I'd spent 12 days learning to read, and what it said was, "Yes, he's still here, and I haven't told him to leave, and that's all I'm going to say about it." Later that afternoon, I walked the fence line with the amended survey documents and marked the corrected boundary with stakes I'd brought from Prescott, proper iron stakes, territorial issue. I counted my steps between them. Of course I did. When I came back to the homestead, the light was going gold and long across the desert, the way it does in that particular hour when the day decides to be beautiful about its ending, and Caleb was outside. He was sitting on the porch steps, just sitting, not doing anything, which I was beginning to understand was unusual for him, and he was looking west at the light on the flats. The bandaging was visible at his collar, but his posture was easier than it had been, the careful management of pain less evident. I sat down on the step beside him. We watched the light for a while. "You told those men the documents were already in Prescott," I said, "when they weren't." "That was a risk." "It was accurate in spirit," he said. "They were going to be in Prescott." The timeline was just compressed, generously presented, he said. I thought about that, about the way he'd chosen words in the barn, precise, careful, leaving just enough room for truth to coexist with necessity. "What happens now," I asked, "for you after the rib?" He was quiet for a moment. The light moved on the desert. "I don't know," he said, and then, with an honesty that I suspected cost him something, "That's not an answer I'm used to having." I thought about range detectives, about men who move through landscapes without settling in them, about what it means when a man like that sits on a particular porch for 12 days and doesn't leave. "The Bautista descendants," I said. "When the investigation reaches them, they'll need an advocate. Someone who knows the terrain, the documentation, who was there at the beginning." He looked at me, considering. "That's a thing that could take years," he said. "Probably," I agreed. A pause. "There's a lot of land in northern Yavapai County that needs accurate surveying," I said. "Official reason for a man to be in the area, consistent with a long-term presence." I wasn't being subtle. I'm a surveyor. I deal in exact measurements. He looked at me with an expression that I believe contained, somewhere inside it, amusement. "You're trying to give me a reason to stay," he said. "I'm observing that the reasons exist," I said. "I leave interpretation to the individual." He was quiet again. Then, "She hasn't asked me to leave." "No," I said. "That's not," he stopped. Started again more carefully. "A woman who's managed 3 years alone, that's not nothing, her not asking." "No," I said, "it's not nothing." The door behind us opened, and Marta came out with a lantern already lit, because the dark comes fast in the desert, and she'd learned to anticipate it. She hung the lantern on the hook at the porch post, a hook that had clearly been there a long time, worn smooth where the lantern handle rode, and then she stood for a moment looking at the last of the light on the flats. "Emmett," she said, "are you staying for supper or are you making the ride back tonight?" "Tonight," I said. "I have reports to file tomorrow morning." She nodded, went back inside. I looked at Caleb. He was looking at the door where she'd been. I saddled my horse in the barn in the last of the evening light and thought about what I was leaving behind me, which is a thing I rarely do. I think forward mostly, next survey, next route, next set of stakes to place. Forward is where the work is. But I thought about it this time. I thought about a root cellar in a dust storm, and a woman with a shotgun, and a large man bleeding apologetically on a step. And I thought about the remarkable instability of the moment between when things are one way and when they become another, and how small the things are that tip the balance. 2 words, for instance, "Trust me," spoken into a howling storm by a man who wasn't asking for trust so much as making a statement about what he intended to deserve. And a woman who had every reason in the world to close the door. And didn't. Before I mounted, I went back to the porch. Caleb was still on the steps. He looked up. "The documents," I said. "The originals, keep them somewhere secure if Dunmore's attorney tries to challenge the chain of evidence." "I know," he said. "And the rib." "I know," he said again, but with a patience that wasn't impatient. I shook his hand. He had a hand like a geographical feature. I counted nothing about it. "You're a good man, Morrow," I said. It came out simply, the way the most direct things do when you stop finding complicated ways to say them. He looked at me steadily. "I'm trying to be," he said. Which is the honest answer. Which is the only answer that actually means anything, I think. Not I am, but I'm trying to be. I rode out as the stars came. I looked back once, just once, from the ridge, and the lantern on the Haverson porch was a small orange light in the dark desert, steady and warm, and it could have meant anything or it could have meant exactly what it looked like. I chose to believe it was exactly what it looked like.